Welcome to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Coming up, we'll review the week's top stories about the closing arguments in the corruption trial of former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan and co-defendant Michael McLean, and the continued conflict between the new Trump administration and Illinois' Democratic leadership on the issue of immigration. I'll then join the Center Square's Dan McCaleb to further discuss those stories and more. That's ahead with Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop.
They're simple, boring, never thought of until they're needed. They're windshield wipers. Only when Mary Anderson became annoyed that New York trolley drivers were stopping to wipe their windshield by hand did anybody do something about it. By attaching a spring-loaded arm to a rubber blade, one woman made travel easier and safer. Look to innovate and pass it on. From passiton.com.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. The reckless homicide of two young women in Urbana in the past weekend at the hands of a suspect in the country illegally is another example of Democratic policies putting people in harm's way, according to an Illinois legislator. Republican State Senator Chapin Rose said the policies enacted by Illinois Democrats go beyond just the taxpayer cost. He said prohibiting local law enforcement from cooperating with immigration officials is putting people's lives in jeopardy.
Whether it's Lake and Riley or these two poor ladies from Urbana last weekend, the Democratic Party in this country and in this state are getting people killed.
Governor J.B. Pritzker, who stands by laws he enacted, said violent illegal immigrants should be deported, but said those who are here illegally but otherwise law-abiding should be protected.
Donald Trump and his administration, Tom Homan, people at the Department of Homeland Security, they're the ones that are threatening people, again, who are law-abiding, who are often the anchors of their communities.
In Urbana last weekend, two women were killed in a crash and the driver fled. The suspect was later arrested near the Mexican border. Reportedly, he was in the country illegally. Prosecutors say the Make Mike Madigan money plan helped the former Illinois House Speaker's law firm gain profits. Jim Talamonte has that story.
Assistant U.S. Attorney Diane MacArthur coined the phrase during closing arguments Thursday afternoon at the Dirksen Federal Building. MacArthur said former Chicago Alderman Daniel Solis connected Madigan with real estate developers. The former Speaker's attorneys are expected to begin closing Friday afternoon. Chicago attorney Sam Adams Jr. described Madigan's team as awesome.
As my dad used to tell me as a kid, there are no such things as great lawyers. There's only great facts and good lawyers to bring those facts out.
Former Assistant U.S. Attorney Patrick Collins said Madigan attorneys Dan Collins, Tom Breen, and Todd Pugh are experienced.
You have lawyers who have gone through the battles and, have rapport with the jury, and we'll see how all that plays out.
In Chicago, I'm Jim Talamonte.
And those are the top stories from the past week from Illinois. Find more online at thecentersquare.com. Coming up for Illinois in Focus, I'll join the Center Square's Dan McCaleb to further discuss the news. This is Illinois in Focus, a production of America's Talking Network. I'm Greg Bishop.
Do you know what elected officials in Illinois are doing with your tax dollars? Do you want to make sure that your voice is heard? If so, then you need Blue Room Stream, a live and archived video streaming service that provides access to government meetings and events. With Blue Room Stream, you can watch how your elected officials make decisions, hold them accountable for their actions, and be a more informed citizen. Blue Room Stream is the perfect way to get involved in the democratic process and to make a difference in your community. Subscribe today at blueroomstream.com.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I'm Dan McCaleb, Chief Content Officer at Franklin News Foundation, publisher of the Center Square Newswire service. As we record this on Thursday afternoon, January 23rd, prosecutors are continuing their closing arguments in the corruption trial of longtime former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan. Defense attorneys for Madigan and co-defendant Michael McLean are expected to begin their closing arguments on Friday and continue into Monday, with the jury to begin deliberations at some point next week. Joining me to discuss this is Greg Bishop, associate editor for the Center Square. Greg, after nearly 4 months of trial, prosecutors are trying to clearly summarize their case against Madigan and McLean, 4 jurors, and they aren't mincing words. Power and profit, Assistant U.S. Attorney Julia Schwartz said as she started to address to the jury, as quoted by the Center Square's Jim Talamonte, who's been in the courthouse since the beginning of the trial. Quote, Michael Madigan and Michael McLean conspired to preserve Madigan's power and line his pockets. That's pretty blunt, Greg.
pretty blunt, and it continued on today. Prosecutors said that Madigan had the keys to ComEd legislation. So after 13, 14, 15 weeks, or however long we've been at this, hearing and seeing and reading what the prosecutors are saying and distilling down all of that evidence, it's clear to at least what's been reported out that they're making the case that Madigan and Michael McLean used Madigan's power, not just as House Speaker, but also as chairman of the Democratic Party of Illinois, controlling the party purse. That amount of power was abused by Madigan and McLean. Now, again, that's just the prosecutors making their pitch, their final pitch to the jury before they take in all of that evidence, the more than 100 pages of jury instruction and 2 different defendants. The jury's going to have to make clear as to if they buy the prosecutor's argument, or we have yet to really hear the defense from Madigan and McLean. Are they going to side with them? So all ears and eyes are going to be watching that federal courthouse in Chicago.
Yeah, Greg, you and I have talked a few times just about how, with months of evidence, just the number of pieces of evidence, the number of witnesses who've taken the stand over, as you said, since the beginning of October, the secret recordings, private phone calls, secret video recordings that have played in the courthouse. This is complex. So this is the moment, really, where prosecutors have to wrap up their case, present what they're accusing Madigan of, and persuade the jury that Madigan and McLean did, in fact, commit crimes. Now, as you said, the defense will have its opportunity starting tomorrow to present their closing arguments. But prosecutors' work is cut out for them here.
There's no question, especially with that recent U.S. Supreme Court ruling, helping to clarify bribery statutes for federal crimes. But, I mean, when you get down to it, prosecutors alleged a nearly 10-year-long scheme they called Madigan Enterprise. Again, 9 years of this that they tracked and they covered. And you even have ComEd, the state's largest utility, providing energy for a large swath of Illinois. They entered a deferred prosecution agreement way back in 2020, essentially saying that they're going to cooperate with federal prosecutors in this, and they even paid a $200 million fine as being part of this. So prosecutors are known for prosecuting cases they are confident they can win. I don't know the exact percentage of guilty verdicts prosecutors get, but I would put money on that it approaches 90%, if not higher. So prosecutors don't just bring loose cases to trial, especially if it's going to be a protracted trial like 13 to 15 weeks long. They bring cases they have evidence on. We've seen the evidence. We've heard the evidence. The jury as well has not just seen and heard that evidence, but they also got a bit of a surprise with Madigan actually providing testimony, deciding to testify in his case. So now they've also heard Madigan's words from his own mouth. The jury's going to have a ton to tackle. Whether it's a day or two actually could be surprising if they only take that much time. But they've got a lot on their plate. As we've said all along, it's a complicated case. But prosecutors with their closing arguments today, and then we'll have a rebuttal after the defense gives their closing arguments, they really are distilling down the crux of this case, that Madigan and McLean abused Madigan's office for personal gain.
Let's just really quickly summarize the allegations. Madigan and McLean are charged with 23 counts of bribery and other official misconduct. The allegations are that the two conspired together to get no work, little work jobs for associates, for their close associates from ComEd, from AT&T, Illinois, in exchange for Madigan allowing legislation to be advanced through the legislature that is favorable to those utilities, those companies' bottom line. As you mentioned, both companies agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors and agreed to pay large sums of money, ComEd being $200 million. I think A&T was like in the neighborhood of $24 million to essentially avoid prosecution. The company's being prosecuted themselves. But jurors also is one juror to not agree, right? In these criminal cases, these criminal trials, it needs to be unanimous. There are 12 jurors, and I think there's 6 alternates in case something happens to one of the jurors, God forbid. But 12 jurors have to reach the same conclusion on each of the 23 counts.
To be a fly on the wall in that room would be fascinating. Quite frankly, though, they've got their work cut out for them, so I'm sure that they're all going to have their own sets of questions that they're going to need to get the answers to come to some kind of verdict.
Right. So who knows, a week from now, could we have a verdict? We don't know. It's going to take a long time for the jurors in the jury room to sift through all the evidence, all the testimony, etc., and they have to make a decision on each and every single count for each of the 2 defendants. So I'm guessing that we will not have a verdict at this time, Greg. But what say you?
I think that's a safe bet, Dan. There's a lot to digest, and the jury's going to have their plate full.
Well, related to the Madigan corruption trial, Greg, lawmakers are talking about the possibility of ethics reform. In the state legislature with Madigan, his nearly 40-year run as House Speaker, he just completely dominated the House during his tenure there. The new Illinois House Speaker, Emanuel Chris Welsh, has essentially adopted the same Madigan rules during his tenure. There have been calls for years for legislative ethics reform in the legislature. A Democrat actually came out in the past week to talk about the need for ethics reforms. You wrote about it, Greg. Tell us.
Yeah, State Representative Eva Dina Delgado actually told Jim Talamonte that she's hopeful for some actual ethics reforms coming out of the state capitol. Now, I don't know if this is going to wait for, the definitive, outcome of whatever the jury decides in the Madigan case, but Republicans have been calling for reforms for quite some time. Delgado said that ethics should be top of mind because anybody who's going to work for the people as an elected official needs to have service top of mind. But, while you have a Democrat coming out saying there needs to be ethics reforms, there's just nothing necessarily substantive that is like a bullet point to say, okay, we're going to prohibit lobbying by former legislators, or we're going to have term limits so that somebody can't be a state representative for 50 years like Mike Madigan was. These types of things, these specifics, we never really get to. It seems to always be lip service about doing what's good for the taxpayer and being accountable and, being good stewards of money and just doing the right thing. But when we get down to the nitty gritty and finding how and what kinds of loopholes there may be, there never is that substantive conversation. Will that change, Dan? That's a big question, right? We're in a new General Assembly. They've been off for the past 2 weeks. They come back next week on Tuesday, and they'll be in for 3 days. Are they going to tackle specific ethics issues? Are they going to wait for the dust to settle out of the Madigan case? Not too sure. However, we do have a Republican and a Democrat joining together. Just got this in, Dan. State Representative Dan Ugasti and Republican and Democrat State Representative LaShawn Ford, they're working to get legislation passed that could have recall provisions for elected officials in Illinois. This is actually a bill that Representative Ford has pushed for several years. And just a few weeks ago, Dan Ugasti proposed a similar bill to have local recall. So maybe that's an ethics reform that we could see materialize at the State House. But in the past, Democrats in control, including Governor J.B. Pritzker, has said that, we have laws on the books already. And those laws on the books, people are being held to account for, like state legislators being arrested for bribery, or, Mike Madigan, he's facing a trial right now, accused of wrongdoing. So Democrats will quick to say, we already have laws in place, but Republicans go deeper, and it looks like Representative Ford, a Democrat, joining in this as well with that mantle of there are substantive things that can be done to have elected officials be accountable to the taxpayers and to the voters. Is it through a recall provision? Maybe. Is it through term limits? Not sure. But are we actually going to hear about these substantive conversations during committees? Dan, we just haven't for years, even though the Madigan saga has been playing out since 2020.
Yeah, and what about the legislative inspector general? Under Madigan's watch, before he resigned the speakership and his House seat, we went through the Me Too movement, where a bunch of lawmakers and other legislative staff were accused of harassment and other claims. We learned back then that the legislative inspector general's position had been vacant for more than a year, and complaints that were filed against lawmakers or their staffs were sitting on a shelf collecting dust. They finally hired a new legislative inspector general, but that person came in, and said that they had no authority to do anything, no subpoena power. They were controlled by legislators who were on a committee overseeing the legislative inspector general. I haven't heard anything about that in years.
Yeah, and I think, we do have a new legislative inspector general. It's been pretty quiet there, but you're right. The previous inspector general quit, calling the office a paper tiger. Right. And that was after they had tried to pass some ethics reforms, but Republicans said that it didn't have enough teeth. And the legislative inspector general is too beholden to a panel of legislators that oversee it, and they can't even move forward with certain investigations and subpoenas or even release information on investigations they've done until they get approval from the panel. Again, that's one aspect of ethics reforms that we've heard a lot about in the years past from Republicans standing at podiums, but we really haven't seen the hard work done of rolling up the sleeves, getting into committees, and discussing this out in the public so that the public and taxpayers know what the problems are clearly and understands what kinds of solutions they're going to bring about. Another quick thing, Dan, the revolving door, right? A lot of people are frustrated when they see a state legislator retire early and then go work for a lobbying firm to go lobby legislators and make more money. But legislators did pass a revolving door prohibition, but again, it was something that could have been much stronger. It allowed for somebody to say, retire at the end of one General Assembly and then within months get a job with a lobbying firm and lobby the next General Assembly. There was no hard date of 2 years. You cannot go and work for a lobbying firm. Those are the types of things where they may pass something, but it doesn't either have teeth or it's not substantive enough. We'll be watching closely this year, especially after the Madigan trial, whatever the outcome is, whether or not legislators are actually going to do the hard work, roll up their sleeves, and get some true ethics reforms in place.
Greg, we're just days into President Donald Trump's second term in office, and really on day 2, Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker started pushing back on some of Trump's executive orders and other policy positions, particularly when it relates to immigration, cooperation with U.S. Customs and immigration enforcement. You wrote about that this week. Tell us.
Dan, I feel like I'm going to be writing about this forever, for at least the next 2 to 4 years, right? Because it's clearly visible that Illinois is going to be one of the states that will be constantly standing up to the new Trump administration. Earlier this week, Governor Pritzker, during an unrelated news conference, asked about whether or not he's had communications with the Trump administration on deportations. He said he has not had communications, though he's heard about possibly 2,000 enforcement actions set to take place. Then today at an unrelated news conference, Dan, the governor, again, fielded questions, and a lot of them dealt with immigration. And in particular, Pritzker, he doubled down on saying that if somebody's in this country illegally and is violent, they should be deported. But he said he will stand up in the way of the Trump administration in their efforts to deport illegal aliens who are otherwise law-abiding. So the governor draws that distinction. All right, so you are a illegal immigrant and you're violent, then you should be kicked out. But if you're an illegal immigrant and you're otherwise following the law, other than being an illegal immigrant, then the state's sanctuary policies are going to protect those people. The governor made that clear today, said it multiple times being asked questions about it. This as the Trump administration is moving forward with getting federal officials on the ground in these various jurisdictions. But the problem is, while we talk about sanctuary cities and sanctuary states, people need to understand what exactly that means. That's not just a jurisdiction that's going to allow somebody to come in and find sanctuary at a church, for instance. Now, what it means is in Illinois, we have multiple different laws that Democrats and Governor J.B. Pritzker have enacted. One is the Trust Act. That essentially says state and local law enforcement cannot cooperate with federal immigration officials under certain circumstances. I've had police even tell me, police officers message me saying they can't even ask somebody they're pulling over their immigration status. You also have the state agencies like the DMV, the Department of Corrections, reiterating that they have to comply with the state's Trust Act and to not cooperate with federal officials unless they have certain documents like federal warrants, for instance. This includes the Department of Corrections that might actually have an inmate that's illegal, but they can't ask that inmate their immigration status. That's the law of the land in the state of Illinois, Dan. But it's not just the Trust Act. There was another law passed several years ago. I believe it was called a Way Forward Act. And what that did is said you cannot have immigration customs enforcement beds in the state of Illinois. The state of Illinois is not going to use tax dollars to pay ICE or vice versa to hold beds. This impacts sheriffs. There's a sheriff up in Kankakee County who's been directly impacted by this. Several years ago, he had beds that they would lease out to ICE, essentially, as places that they could detain people who are getting ready to be deported. Once that state law kicked in, that those beds were no longer available at that county jail. So you can see these types of laws that Illinois put in place. That's led individuals like Republican State Senator Chapin Rose to essentially say that these policies that are in place because of Democrats, they're getting people killed. He pointed to Lake and Riley down in Georgia. But also, just recently this past weekend in Urbana, 2 young women were killed after a car crash where a suspect fled. And that suspect, Dan, a Mexican national who was arrested just 2 hours away from the Mexico border. So clearly, we're going to hear a lot more about this, especially as Pritzker remains defiant, Mayor Brandon Johnson remains defiant, and you've got pockets throughout the states that are sanctuary cities or welcoming cities where this could play out and get louder and louder and louder. I don't think the story's going away anytime soon.
It's certainly not. Trump's new border czar, Tom Homan, has said that Chicago very well could be ground zero for the deportation efforts. Homan has also warned state and local authorities that if they refuse to cooperate, they're violating federal law, and there's the potential that they could be charged with something. Now, that sounds like that might be a bit extreme, but they're not playing games. Trump and Homan and the new ICE administrators are serious about their deportation plans.
Yeah, and you've got the continued opposition stacking up to Trump from states like New York, New Mexico, Rhode Island, Hawaii, California, Illinois. Attorney General Kwame Raoul just joined attorneys generals from other states saying that they're not going to have their local law enforcement, quote, commandeered for federal immigration enforcement. We'll see what happens in the next 2 years heading into the midterm and Governor J.B. Pritzker being up for re-election. Will he run for office or will he gear things towards presidential bid? It's going to be a fascinating time, and I want people to get out over to thecentersquare.com and be sure to subscribe to get that newsletter with the headlines in your inbox.
Subscribe to that newsletter, Greg. Thank you for joining us today. You can also get all the news that we talked about today and so much more at thecentersquare.com.